I need to see your ID right now.
Why? What's the problem?
You match a description. Stop resisting questions and hand it over.
This is unnecessary.
Let me see some ID. You're coming with me.
I'm a federal agent.
The encounter does not begin with a crime. It begins with movement. A young man walking, a uniformed officer following, and a decision made before a single lawful threshold is clearly crossed. What unfolds next is not driven by urgency or public danger, but by something far more subtle and far more common. An officer's determination to turn curiosity into compliance and compliance into control. At the outset, the officer frames the interaction as casual, even conversational. The language is deliberately soft. There is no declaration of detention, no explanation of authority, no articulation of reasonable suspicion. Instead, there is an invitation, codis, a request to stop, a suggestion that a conversation might resolve everything. This framing is important because it creates the illusion of choice where none will ultimately be allowed to exist. The citizen is meant to feel free while being watched, guided, and quietly boxed in. When the young man does not immediately comply, the officer's tone shifts, not abruptly but incrementally. This is where the psychology of escalation begins. The request becomes insistence. The insistence becomes instruction. Still, no crime is identified. No specific allegation is named. The officer does not say what law has been violated, only that he wants the individual to stop. In constitutional terms, this is a critical moment. A consensual encounter remains lawful only so long as the person involved is free to ignore the officer and walk away. The moment that freedom is challenged without legal justification, the encounter crosses a line. And the young man continues walking. His movement is calm, not evasive. He does not run, he does not threaten, he does not discard anything. What he does do is refuse to surrender his autonomy without explanation. In many bodycam cases, this is where officers either disengage or escalate. Here, escalation is chosen. The officer introduces a justification after the fact, a vague description connected to an unspecified incident. This description is not detailed enough to establish reasonable suspicion on its own, and its timing matters. It appears only after the citizen resists the initial attempt at control. This sequencing is significant. Rather than suspicion leading to detention, detention is attempted first, and justification follows later. This reversal is one of the most common structural failures in unconstitutional stops. As the interaction moves toward pursuit, the officer's language hardens. Commands replace conversation. The word stop is repeated, stripped of explanation and infused with authority. Backup is requested, not because of any threat posed by the individual, but because compliance has not been achieved. This is a revealing detail. The presence of additional units is often framed as safety-driven, but here it functions as leverage, a way to overwhelm resistance through numbers rather than law. The young man vocalizes what many citizens recognize instinctively, that he is being targeted without cause. His frustration is not loud at first. It is incredulous. He is trying to understand why walking away from a voluntary interaction has suddenly transformed into grounds for arrest. The officer does not answer this question directly. Instead, he reframes the refusal to stop as obstruction. This is a pivotal transformation. Obstruction, in theory, requires interference with a lawful duty. But if the underlying stop lacks legal grounding, then refusal cannot logically become obstruction. This circular reasoning, where noncompliance retroactively justifies enforcement, is a recurring pattern in bodycam footage across jurisdictions. It allows officers to convert their own overreach into a chargeable offense. When physical custody is initiated, the narrative presented by law enforcement becomes absolute. You're under arrest. No further explanation is offered. The legality of the initial stop is treated as irrelevant, overwritten by the new reality of handcuffs and patrol cars. At this stage, the power imbalance becomes total. The young man's voice, once part of the interaction, is now characterized as noise, emotional, disruptive, something to be managed rather than heard. The officer's justifications continue to evolve. What began as a desire to talk becomes an investigation. What began as a match to clothing becomes association with a crime. Each explanation is delivered confidently, but none are tested in the moment. The presence of authority shields these claims from immediate scrutiny. Bodycam footage captures this phenomenon repeatedly. Certainty replacing clarity, confidence standing in for proof. As the young man is placed into custody, his distress becomes physical. His breathing changes, his body reacts to the sudden loss of control. The shock of confinement, the realization that compliance would not have spared him escalation, only delayed it. Officers respond with procedural gestures, offering water, calling medical assistance, instructing him to breathe. These actions, while necessary, also function as narrative insulation. They present the officers as caretakers, even as the legality of their actions remains unresolved. Inside the station, the tone shifts again. The environment itself reinforces authority. Walls, doors, benches, each element communicates permanence and inevitability. The officer explains the arrest with a practiced calm, emphasizing procedure and minimizing discretion. "It's the law," he says, a phrase often used not to clarify statutes but to close conversation. Law becomes a blunt instrument rather than a defined standard. Crucially, the underlying suspicion collapses. The investigation reveals that the young man is not the person sought. The clothing match dissolves under scrutiny. The incident that justified the stop no longer applies. In a system built on accountability, this would be the end of the matter. The arrest would be recognized as a mistake, the detention acknowledged as unlawful, and the citizen released without consequence. That does not happen. Instead, the system pivots once more. Though the original rationale for the stop is gone, a new justification remains: resistance. The very act of questioning authority, of refusing an unjustified stop, has been preserved as the basis for charges. This is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the encounter. It reveals how easily an officer's initial error can be insulated from consequence by secondary charges that arise only because the error occurred. This is not an anomaly, it is a structural feature. When officers are empowered to escalate without clear thresholds, and when courts and departments tolerate post hoc rationalizations, the burden of legality shifts entirely onto the citizen. Compliance becomes the only safe option, not because the law demands it, but because resistance, even lawful resistance, carries unacceptable risk. The body cam does not show a violent suspect or a dangerous criminal. It shows a young man leaving school, moving through public space, exercising the most basic form of freedom, walking away. The escalation that follows is not driven by threat, but by offense, not at what the individual did, but at what he refused to do. By the end of this first phase, The power dynamic has fully inverted. The officer's authority is no longer tied to suspicion or evidence, but to outcome. An arrest has occurred, therefore it must be justified. The system closes ranks around that premise. The individual's experience, fear, confusion, physical distress, becomes secondary to maintaining the appearance of control. This case is not about a single decision, but about a sequence of small ones. A request that should have remained optional, a suspicion articulated too late, a refusal treated as defiance, each step alone might appear minor. Together they form a path that leads inexorably to custody, charges, and trauma, all without the presence of an actual crime. And this is where the real story begins. Not with the arrest itself, but with what happens after the justification disappears, and the system is forced to confront, or avoid, the consequences of its own actions. Once the initial justification collapses, the system does not reverse course. It recalibrates. This is the quiet middle phase of many bodycam encounters, the moment where the stated reason for police action no longer holds, yet the machinery of enforcement continues to move forward as though nothing fundamental has changed. Inside the station, the encounter is no longer framed as dynamic or uncertain. It is procedural now. Paperwork replaces pursuit. Doors replace open space. The narrative solidifies, not around what actually happened, but around what must now be defended. The officer's earlier decisions, made in seconds on the street, are translated into formal language that will outlive the video itself. This translation is where accountability often erodes. The officer explains the situation to others with confidence. The explanation is smooth, uninterrupted, and authoritative. The earlier ambiguity is gone. In its place is a simplified story. An individual matched a description, refused to stop, and was lawfully arrested. What is omitted is just as important as what is included. There is no mention of the delayed articulation of suspicion. No acknowledgement that the description alone lacked specificity. No reflection on whether the refusal to stop occurred during a consensual encounter. This is how institutional narratives are formed, not through lies, but through selective emphasis. The bodycam captures a complex sequence of events, but the official account compresses it into something far more defensible. Once this version is written, it becomes the default truth, referenced by supervisors, prosecutors, and judges who may never watch the full footage. Meanwhile, the young man's experience continues to deteriorate. The adrenaline that carried him through the arrest fades, replaced by physiological stress. His breathing becomes labored. His body signals distress in ways that cannot be ignored. Officers respond appropriately on the surface, calling for medical assistance, offering water, attempting to calm him. These actions are necessary, but they also serve a secondary function. They visually reposition law enforcement as caretakers rather than instigators. This dual role, enforcer and caregiver, is one of the most powerful shields against scrutiny. By addressing the symptoms of distress, the system avoids confronting its cause. The young man is treated for anxiety, but the anxiety itself is framed as an internal issue rather than a rational response to sudden confinement and loss of control. Importantly, the officers do not revisit the legality of the arrest during this period. There is no discussion about whether the stop should have occurred, no acknowledgement that the initial suspicion has evaporated. The focus remains forward-facing, processing, documentation, containment. Once a person is in custody, the system is structurally disincentivized from admitting error. Doing so would unravel everything that followed. This is where the charge of resisting or obstructing becomes indispensable. It functions as a legal anchor, keeping the arrest afloat even as its original foundation sinks. The logic is circular but effective. The individual is charged because he did not comply, and the non-compliance is criminal because the officer demanded compliance. The underlying legality of that demand is rarely tested in the moment. The young man attempts to assert himself verbally. He explains where he was coming from. He references school, normalcy, routine, details that underscore how abruptly his day was derailed. These statements are not argumentative, they are contextual. He is trying to reinsert himself into a process that has rendered him passive. The response he receives is polite but final. His perspective is acknowledged only insofar as it doesn't alter the outcome. This asymmetry is crucial. Officers are allowed to explain, justify, and narrate freely. The detained individual's explanations, by contrast, have no practical effect. They are recorded, perhaps noted, but they do not influence the immediate decision-making. The imbalance is not just physical, it is epistemic. One side's account shapes reality. The other's is background noise. As time passes, the language used by law enforcement subtly shifts again. Earlier, the officer spoke of what had to be done. Now he speaks of what will be done. The future is assumed, not negotiated. This linguistic shift reflects a deeper transformation. Discretion has hardened into inevitability. The system is no longer responding to behavior, it is executing a process. Even when the investigation confirms that the young man is not the suspect sought, the revelation is treated as a footnote rather than a turning point. There is no visible reckoning, no recalibration of authority. The arrest does not unwind. Instead, the officers pivot seamlessly to the remaining charges, as though the initial mistake were irrelevant. This is perhaps the most revealing moment of the entire encounter. It demonstrates how the system prioritizes procedural continuity over substantive justice. The goal is not to arrive at the correct outcome, but to preserve the legitimacy of the actions already taken. Admitting that the stop was unjustified would call into question the arrest, the search, the detention, a cascade of consequences too costly to acknowledge. The young man's physical distress intensifies the moral tension of the situation. He is no longer just detained. He is vulnerable. Medical personnel arrive, and their presence adds another layer of authority. Their focus is narrow and appropriate. Symptoms, vitals, stabilization. But their involvement also normalizes the situation. What began as an unjustified stop now looks, on camera, like a coordinated response to a medical event. This normalization is powerful. It reframes the narrative for any future viewer who does not watch closely. The image becomes one of officers patiently assisting a distressed individual, rather than officers grappling with the consequences of an unlawful escalation. Context is everything, and here context is quietly stripped away. Throughout this phase, there is an absence that speaks volumes. Supervision. No commanding officer steps in to reassess the stop. No one pauses the process to ask whether the arrest should proceed now that the suspicion is gone. The system operates on inertia. Each participant assumes that someone else has validated the decision, when in reality, no such validation has occurred. This diffusion of responsibility is a hallmark of institutional failure. When everyone plays a small role, no one feels accountable for the whole. The officer who initiated the stop defends his decision. The officers who assisted rely on his explanation. The medical staff addresses the symptoms. The paperwork moves forward. At no point does anyone own the injustice in its entirety. The charge that remains, resisting or obstructing, is framed as self-evident. The young man did not stop when told to stop. That fact is undisputed. What is disputed and what remains unresolved is whether he was legally required to do so. That question, however, is deferred. It will be decided later in a courtroom or not at all. In the meantime, the consequences are immediate and real. This deferral is itself a form of power. By pushing legality downstream, the system ensures compliance upstream. Citizens are effectively told, obey now, challenge later. But later comes with costs, legal fees, time, stress, records that many cannot afford. The result is a chilling effect on lawful resistance, even when that resistance is constitutionally protected. By the end of this second phase, the encounter has fully transitioned from an on-the-street escalation to an institutionalized process. The chaos of the initial stop has been replaced by order, but it is an order built on unresolved illegality. The young man sits, waits, breathes, and endures, while the system around him moves efficiently toward a conclusion that was never inevitable, but now feels unavoidable. This is the quiet danger of such encounters. Not the shouting, not the handcuffs, but the smoothness with which an error becomes routine. The way a questionable decision hardens into an official record. The way a human being's resistance to unjust authority is transformed into evidence of guilt. And yet, the story is not finished. Because what remains is not just the outcome of this case, but the broader implications, the patterns it reflects, the incentives it reveals, and the questions it leaves unanswered about how many similar encounters end the same way, without cameras, without scrutiny, and without resolution. By the time the encounter reaches its final stage, the outcome is no longer shaped by evidence or intent. It is shaped by momentum. What began as a discretionary interaction has hardened into a record, and records have gravity. They pull everything toward them, narratives, justifications, and consequences alike. The young man's immediate crisis subsides. His breathing steadies. The medical concern is addressed just enough to allow the process to continue. This, too, is revealing. The system is not designed to pause indefinitely for reflection or correction. Once stabilized, the individual is returned to the flow of enforcement. Care is provided, but only to the extent necessary to resume custody. At this stage, the language of law enforcement becomes almost entirely administrative. Names are recorded, reports are referenced. Decisions are framed as routine. The earlier tension, the shouting, the pursuit, the physical restraint, recedes into the background. What remains is a sanitized version of events, suitable for documentation and review. This is where the long-term impact of such encounters is often decided, not in the heat of the moment, but in the calm that follows. And the officer's report will likely emphasize compliance failures over contextual details. The timing of the suspicion, the vagueness of the description, and the citizen's lawful right to walk away may receive little attention. What will stand out is the refusal to stop and the resulting arrest. The young man's voice, captured on bodycam, will exist alongside this report, but the two will not carry equal weight. Written narratives, especially those authored by officers, are often afforded a presumption of accuracy. Video is treated as supplemental, something to be consulted only if disputes arise. In many cases, it is never reviewed in full. This asymmetry shapes outcomes long before a courtroom is involved. Prosecutors rely on reports to determine charges. Supervisors rely on reports to assess conduct. If the report frames the encounter as lawful and necessary, there is little incentive to dig deeper. The system rewards efficiency, not introspection. What makes this encounter particularly instructive is not its uniqueness, but its familiarity. Every element follows a pattern seen repeatedly in bodycam footage nationwide. A vague description, a consensual encounter that quietly transforms into a detention, a refusal reframed as obstruction, a charge that survives even when the original suspicion does not. These patterns persist because they are rarely challenged internally. Officers are trained to assert authority, but not always to articulate its limits. Departments emphasize control and safety, but often at the expense of constitutional nuance. The result is a culture where escalation is normalized and de-escalation is seen as optional. The young man's experience illustrates the human cost of this imbalance. He leaves not as a suspect cleared of wrongdoing, but as an arrestee charged with resisting. The distinction matters. One outcome affirms innocence. The other imposes a burden, legal, psychological, and social, that lingers long after the encounter ends. Even if charges are later dropped or reduced, the damage is not undone. The stress response, triggered during the arrest, does not vanish. The trust eroded in that moment is not easily rebuilt. For many individuals, especially young people, such encounters redefine their relationship with law enforcement permanently. From the officer's perspective, the encounter may be remembered differently. It becomes one call among many, one instance of asserting control in a job defined by unpredictability. The absence of immediate consequences reinforces the belief that the actions taken were justified. Without feedback loops that meaningfully challenge decisions, patterns remain unchanged. This is where institutional failure becomes most apparent. Accountability mechanisms exist on paper, but they are rarely activated by cases like this. There is no excessive force, no clear policy violation, no dramatic misconduct. Instead, there is a slow drift away from constitutional standards, facilitated by ambiguity and inertia. The body cam, often touted as a tool of transparency, captures everything, but it does not interpret. Interpretation is left to institutions that may lack the will to scrutinize their own. Without external pressure, footage becomes archival rather than corrective. The charge of resisting or obstructing plays a central role in this dynamic. It is flexible, subjective, and easily applied. Its broad scope allows officers to penalize non-compliance without revisiting the legality of their commands. As long as such charges remain commonplace and lightly scrutinized, the incentive to escalate remains intact. For the public, encounters like this often appear confusing. Viewers may focus on the moment of arrest, debating whether the individual should have simply stopped. This framing misses the deeper issue. The question is not whether compliance would have avoided arrest. It almost certainly would have. The question is whether compliance should be the only safeguard against unlawful detention. A system that requires unquestioning obedience to prevent harm, is not one that respects rights. Rights are meaningful only when they can be exercised without punishment. Walking away from a consensual encounter is one such right. When that act becomes the trigger for arrest, the right exists in theory but not in practice. This encounter also highlights how race, while not explicitly acknowledged by officers, shapes perception and escalation. The young man articulates what he believes is happening to him. The officer denies it, framing the stop as purely descriptive. Both statements can coexist without resolution. The system does not require officers to examine implicit bias, only to deny explicit intent. The absence of overtly racist language does not negate the impact of selective enforcement. Descriptions that rely heavily on clothing and location, without additional identifiers, disproportionately affect certain populations. When combined with aggressive enforcement of compliance, the result is predictable. By the end of the footage, the system has achieved its goal: order restored, process completed, authority affirmed. What it has not achieved is justice. The original purpose of the stop, to investigate a specific incident, has failed. The outcome serves only to validate the escalation itself. This is the quiet tragedy of such cases. There is no dramatic wrongdoing to condemn, no singular villain to blame. Instead, there is a convergence of incentives, habits, and assumptions that produce harm without malice. The system does not need bad actors to fail. It only needs unchecked discretion. For viewers, the value of this footage lies not in outrage, but in recognition. Recognition of how easily ordinary moments can become extraordinary consequences. Recognition of how rights erode not through repeal, but through routine disregard. Recognition of how power, once asserted, resists correction. The young man will carry this experience forward. The officers likely will not. That asymmetry is itself a measure of power. One side absorbs the cost, the other moves on, until institutions are structured to share that cost through meaningful review, transparent accountability, and enforceable standards. Encounters like this will continue. This is not an argument against policing, nor is it a condemnation of individuals. It is an examination of systems that prioritize control over consent, outcome over legality, and efficiency over equity. Bodycam footage offers a window into these dynamics, but only if viewers are willing to look beyond the surface. In the end, the most revealing moment is not the arrest, the distress, or the resolution. It is the silence around what should have happened once the suspicion was disproven. That silence speaks louder than any command.